am starting the recording. It is my great pleasure to introduce one of the great thinkers, in my opinion, of the Libertarian Party, Jerry Van Sickle, who has been a member of the party and active, probably 25, 30 years. Would that be about right?
1979.
Since 79. 7
You do
years
the
after
math.
the formation of the party, what took you so long?
I'm ashamed.
You should be ashamed. I joined the party in 2000 when I moved to Boulder, but that's besides the point. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jerry Van Sickle, who is will be there. He is on camera. Wave, Jerry.
I don't see myself there.
Yeah, there's the camera. And today's presentation is focusing on the courts as a libertarian form of government. That's my title. I didn't get a title from Jerry, so Jerry, is that a fairly decent title for the for this debate presentation?
Only to get started. So brace yourself.
Very good.
Okay.
The floor is yours, Jerry. Please speak up so that both the people at the other end of the table can hear you, and the people who are at home and viewing this on YouTube can hear you.
Ralph has invited me to defend my suggestion that appellate court decisions may offer a far better path to our goals than politics and legislation. So, I hope you'll join us in brainstorming this possibility, and this may be a good-sized group to do this in, and several other paths that could become highways. And I'm talking about things we can do, not just the ideas that we want to spread. Before you leave, I'll offer you each a copy of the questions that I'm going to ask you, but I want to ask them one at a time so we can ponder them and build some sort of it's a construction that I have in mind. You'll see as we go along. And I invite you to talk with me, email me afterwards. I'll have my email address, and to schedule coffee or to continue this dialogue when we continue in our future meetings. So it's going to be a sequence of questions. Our first one: are individual rights our primary concern?
Should I repeat the question? Are individual rights our primary concern? Does anybody want to respond to that Socratic question?
Our being libertarians? Well, yes. I would say so.
Can rights and justice be entrusted to slim majorities and more likely powerful minorities?
Certainly not.
See where I'm going. Unlike appellate court decisions that respond to all sides and their reasoning.
Could you repeat that again?
Well, excuse me, that's quite an assertion you're making as if it's a truth. And I just can't believe it. The appellates are put in place by that majority or by the people in power, and very the same mechanism. So to think that their vested interests are, you've made an assertion there in the body of the question, but I think that assertion itself is you have to say, are appellates free from any of that same problems that majority, minority, power-hungry people problem?
They seem to uphold the Constitution.
So are the legislature.
So did our legislature, and so did everybody else. That's every policeman, I think, is also sworn to uphold the Constitution.
I spent two years monitoring, looking at appellate court and Supreme Court cases on land use, which is where I've been involved as an architect and builder. I read an awful lot of these cases, and far more than in any legislative debates or legislation that I've read, which we typically don't read at all, they do almost invariably word the two sides, the opinions of the two sides. They condense but word them and go to the trouble of explaining their reason for choosing between them or their own settlement of that particular case. So it's a far more tangible, in writing, a tangible evidence of what I'm going to suggest becomes the rule of law than legislation.
Yeah, but they make those decisions in the context of existing statutes.
Oh,
as
yes.
a result of legislation. So it's not as if they're just freewheeling and making their decisions, on the basis of nothing. So it's not.
Roger, could I ask you to take that microphone over there and move it more or less close to you?
So as I was saying, it's not as if they're just freewheeling and making decisions on the basis of nothing. They're making decisions on the basis of existing statutes. So the idea that the judges are out there creating disembodied, law in some way is simply not true.
But of course, some of the parties to any case are challenging at least the interpretation of existing law. So they are dealing with a challenge to existing decisions or existing
For sure,
laws.
but they're challenging the interpretation of a law.
Oh, yes. No,
Right?
I thoroughly agree.
It means that they're challenging at the margin a law which has been established by a legislature.
What is happening now, and this comes from some of the people I've talked about, the Institute for Justice, are you aware of them? Some of their spokesmen are suggesting that they see a beginning of what may become abandoning an almost century-old tendency for the courts to, what do they call it, judicial restraint.
No, deference.
Deference, right. Yes. So they're deferring to legislation, which is...
Sorry, but just to be clear,
yes.
Deference means that we defer to the legislature. The dominant doctrine now among conservative jurists is original intent. So a notion of deference would be to say, the famous quote is Don Willett, who basically say you expect the court's gavel to be a rubber stamp. Okay, so they are abandoning the idea of being a rubber stamp for whatever the legislation is, and insisting on comparing that to the Constitution. But that again does not mean that they're just creating law out of whole cloth.
Well, no, but they're all... You have a... Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think the context is important.
Could I have the microphone handed over to Bob?
Thank you. The context is important here, because if you're talking about starting out looking for common law to be created and to be what things are judged by, you don't have legislatures, you don't have the Constitution. You have practices in the community that you're a part of. And so I think it's pretty important to get the idea of what context we're talking about. Are we starting with a Constitution and legislatures and laws here when we talk about courts becoming the government? Or are we talking about building up common law to guide our behavior?
I am certainly doing that. And we did inherit a common law, largely British for most of the colonies. And therein lies the kind of rules that we're talking about, are we not, when we talk about individual rights and therefore individual wrongs, or those of us who is doing the harm, who is being harmed. And this may be the essence, and that's part of my case, the essence of law. Not all of these, and it's Hayek that, by the way, suggests that parliaments, in fact, are largely dealing with marching orders for the various government agencies. That would be the ideal, would be that the law just with among us, trying to get along together in a community, are common to all of us. And the rest is not needed for us to find the rules to live peacefully with each other. And that's the rule of law that I'm suggesting we focus on.
I think, again, I think we're going to transfer to talking about, it's sometimes, sometimes, I mean, one of the problems I think with a lot of libertarians is you get to and I've had these discussions in kind of commenting sections, and it's like you point out a fundamental problem. You point out a fundamental problem, and the answer always is, well, we'll just leave that to the judges to decide, common law, okay? As if it's magic, okay? The reality is that, first off, I don't know why we're particularly comfortable with the idea, if we don't like the idea of majoritarian rule, all right? And we don't, and there's good reason. And by the way, the judicial deference guys basically accept majoritarian rule, whereas the new, someone like Bork basically was, saying that I, as a jurist, should not be making these decisions if you made by majority rule. Someone like Willett is basically saying, no. There are certain decisions that majority rule should also not be making. So that's the distinction that the guys from the Institute of Justice are making.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But but if we're uncomfortable with the idea of majoritarian rule, why are we necessarily always comfortable with the idea of a single judge making a decision?
Because among the answers is we can find another case because we can see what we see as errors in his.
The way our legal system works is it's very driven by precedent. So if you get a single judge who makes a bad decision from a libertarian perspective, then it's actually going to be difficult for other judges to kind of say, wait a minute, no, that was a stupid idea. You shouldn't have decided on that basis, and we should be reversing that decision. As you know, the way, and it's very much a common law doctrine to focus on judicial precedents. And so it's not obvious to me, I'm really saying first, common law and the Hayekian view of spontaneous order for Kayami, I totally accept, okay?
Right.
But I think very often libertarians are too facile about this. They kind of just say, oh, well, common law will take care of it. That's point number one. And point number two is, it's not obvious to me, and again, despite all appearances, I'm not a lawyer. It's not obvious to me that that in practice, many of the things that we as libertarians most decry are judicial decisions, including appellate decisions. Some of the most stupid stuff we've seen the government do has been appellate decisions. And then also to go to Bill's comment, which was, the old Roman, frame, who will guard the guardians? The reality is, the judges have to be appointed by somebody, right? And those people, as well as the people who are appointed, will also have a specific, or may also have a specific agenda. So I guess what I'm objecting to, there's a lot of common law which is very beneficial, but I guess I'm objecting to the notion that this is a magic cure for all of our problems.
Well, let me keep going, and I appreciate what you're saying.
The gentleman behind you has a question, has a comment or a question, and somebody else wishes to speak. You were pointing at somebody, Jerry.
Yes, Bob Jack.
Okay, Bob, would you bring? Yeah, thank you so much. And this gentleman over there wishes to speak. Please speak up since you're at distance from the microphone.
Let's keep in mind the parties are important. Many disputes are solved in the here and now by armed force. We don't like that. Let's transfer military things over to criminal law. Criminal law has the state as a party, and the state is often a corrupt party. So let's transfer those disputes over to tort law between two individual parties. And then let's say, not that Jerry is saying this is an ideal form of government, but that it is less bad than all the legislatures and other forms of government that we have, and I think he's absolutely correct in that.
Jerry, was there a procedure you wanted to follow? Because Bill was telling me something, and I want to make sure it's
I
right.
thought you wanted to go ahead.
Well, I will take some more steps. Well, we had two people that were
Okay, so
lined up.
there was
Am I next?
Bill, so there was Bob Sheffield, and then there's Deidre.
Okay. I want to, there are several ways to go about this. In the first place, if you're starting from nothing, you don't have a judge out there that you're going to go to. You're going to select the person or the group of people that you want to sit in judgment of a particular situation.
And how is it, you're saying the parties to the dispute will select the judge?
Yes.
And what if they can't? What if one refuses to select the judge?
Well, you get that somewhere, and that comes under what I suppose is going to come up here. How do you deal with the criminal situation?
Correct.
If civil, I think we're covered very
Civil,
well.
there's no dispute. Civil is the easy case.
I don't know. I've been a party to some that were not all that easy.
I shouldn't say it's an easy case. A civil dispute where people agree on judge, just like an arbitration process, is the easy case. It's the trivial case. The difficult case is criminal cases. I mean, I'm a businessman. I write into contracts all the time. If we have a civil dispute over the meaning of this contract, it'll be resolved by this arbitrator. That's trivial. That's the easy case. The difficult case is criminal, or a civil case where people don't agree on or on arbitration, or those are the cases that are difficult to deal with.
So you get a hung jury if you are wise and choose multiple
No,
people.
I'm not saying you get a hung jury. You haven't even gotten to the jury. One
Well, I
party
think you
has
do.
refused to accept the notion that they are bound by the decision of any entity.
I think we have the communication capability these days to let people know who are bad people to do business with. And so what happens is you have ostracize people, for one thing. And ultimately, you take armed self-defense.
You can't have armed self. If I'm driving a car and I run into your car, okay, and you say, wait a minute, you ran into my car, you owe me damages. I say no.
We have a tradition here of not taking away the floor from the speaker.
I apologize.
And let the individuals, get a question in and have the speaker decide what's going to go on. So having the discussion, as interesting as it is, this is the point of having a speaker.
Okay, Jerry, take my
Thank you.
side.
In fact, let me take the next step this way. To be very specific, what if we were to ask the Institute for Justice for the specific cases that they would like support for, or the kind of cases for us to be on the lookout for, and to let them know of this? Could our meager funds be far more effective? $1 from each of, we got 1 million of us, right? And they're willing to vote. $1 from each of us will fund a case, and that's the kind of thing we can't begin to accomplish in the legislative arena. Okay.
Frank, and please stand. I need you to stand and also get the microphone.
Okay.
Can you get the microphone, please?
Yeah. Sorry. Bill's guest of about 6 weeks ago is the poster child for this, and I forget the full details, but he was making far more progress in the courts than he ever expected to make and I think it was based on religious freedoms.
It's Bill William Little Sisters of the Poor. He's got those the Hobby Lobby case. I think his name was Bill, and I can't remember the last name. I can't remember his organization, but yeah, Institute of Justice. And I can go look up the, well, I can't go look up the.
Okay.
There are people making wonderful progress for freedom using the courts.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question. I don't know.
The microphone, please.
I think we saw a really good example of the discussion that we were having earlier, where somebody was basically taking the floor, okay, and somebody else said, we have a tradition. So we do have traditions. We have a culture, and this group has its own culture. And what we saw somebody acquiescing voluntarily to that tradition. Would anybody like to comment?
I'll be making comments on that in my presentation. Jerry, we have about 15 minutes left for you.
Okay.
You want to run through this?
Yeah, I'll try to go more rapidly so I can get these things into the mill here, not just for today.
No, that's okay.
But what I would then say, if we decided to do this sort of thing, I would say we use campaigns then to give a much bigger picture of our views. We shouldn't really be expecting to win most elections or to get anything close to a majority for a while. So I'm always disappointed that we don't use the elections to paint a much bigger picture of what we're looking at, on the grounds that I think almost all human beings would favor what we favor if we could get it across to them. So let me go on to, and this next idea I want to bring can be treated separately, but it's consistent with what we're talking about here. Are regulations a major and necessary reason for legislation? Is my question. I'll keep asking questions here, given the time limit here. But ponder that one. I'm going to give you copies of these, and I'll appreciate any responses. Should regulations save more lives and other financial losses than they cost? Should they be cost effective? Will insurance fund every cost effective investment in safety? Then, exposing regulations, this would expose regulations that favor crony capitalists and fund both major parties. Can public services like private alternatives keep improving and saving more dollars? Police services, prisons, welfare, healthcare, research, education, and on top of above all these, international peacekeeping. One more area, taxes. Will taxes and spending require legislation? If cost-effective public and private alternatives keep saving our money and our lives, can big data keep identifying the best methods, skills, and technologies, inspiring endless improvements and lower costs as in private markets? Until these savings refund our taxes, then keep rewarding us more and more. Later, I don't need to do it. I can use land use planning and zoning, but I won't go on to that as a case in point. So now I'll welcome responses to any of this chain of...
Deidre, you wanted to speak, so
Yeah.
speak up loud and move the microphone closer to you.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier in your last comment, which I think is really interesting, and that is the cost-benefit analysis of the different kinds of advocacy we could be doing. in the courts versus electing people versus, working with NORML for marijuana legalization, working with Institute for Justice, getting local libertarian people elected, getting them on the ballot even though they don't get elected. I think it makes a lot of sense to do some brainstorming about the different options that we have in being advocates, and then get out an Excel spreadsheet and look at where our time and dollars could best be spent and what the return on those time and dollars would be in terms of liberty. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I wonder if anybody is doing that, and if not, I think we should definitely consider it.
I appreciate that, and here's a possible answer.
Okay, and Frank, thank you for the
Um,
statement.
I like the,
You guys see stand so people can see it? Okay.
Roll back.
Thank you.
with regards to Deidre's comment, I think what happens is people end up pursuing what they're passionate about, then eventually become disgruntled, and then start going after another passionate. And I'm afraid it's more passionate than spreadsheet, but I agree with you, spreadsheets help. So I'll go back to sleep.
But don't forget now with your comment that I'm talking about seeing if we could get the government to be cost effective, or our fellow citizens to insist that it measure its effectiveness and adapt those examples, public or private, that are the most cost effective.
Let me jump in and ask a question of this, Jerry, which is, how does this tie in with the use of the courts as opposed to the legislature for doing these kinds of regulations?
Tying in for me, it's the things we take upon ourselves, which is what you're supporting here. It's all a question of what we put in the bulk of our time and the bulk of our meager funds. And so I've reduced the original topic to one of several.
Okay.
I tried to suggest this to you on a couple of times before this came up, but I didn't convey it well.
We can certainly have another session at some point in the future where we talk about the most effective way of spending libertarian dollars to affect change. I was hoping today would be the use of the court system as a form of government. Go ahead, Roger.
No, I would just say I think again, following your desire for spontaneous order, I think each one of us makes that decision. I, for example, donate to the Institute for Justice. Just like I donate to Cato. Cato obviously works from on a legislative perspective. The Institute for Justice works in courtrooms. I mean, one of the big pushes of the Institute for Justice now is trying to overrule occupational licensing in as many places as possible. So I think the reality is we have to act in both cases, and I think each of us makes the Libertarian Party is not donating to any of these organizations per se. Each of us makes that decision in terms of our own donations.
No.
The gentleman behind you wishes to make a comment. Please yell.
One of my quick tests for what's happening legislatively is this treating people like adults or like children? National health insurance treats us all like children. A free market treats us as adults. And so between a legislative solution where we grant power to somebody and they rule for all of us in advance of us doing anything, clearly treats us as children. Jerry's alternative, common law coming up from the bottom, respecting precedent, because that's how you have certainty as to the law, is all treating us like adults. again, Roger, you said, well, sometimes there's a bad precedent. In this country, we certainly have 50 states, and many will reach conflicting points of view, and out of the appellate process, it hooks down to something definite. And although I would certainly have a preference for a better ruling than a worse ruling, the main thing is that society goes along without anybody saying, today we're going to have a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week because that's what the people of France want. And so if you have a few bad decisions, over time they will become sticking points. Somebody will challenge them, they will be overturned. But for the bulk of things, you simply look to what has been decided and you guide your affairs accordingly.
Anybody else? Jerry, do you wish to comment? Do you wish to conclude? It's whatever you'd like.
I think it's your turn, so tackle our
Well, if
initiative.
it's my turn, I'm going to turn off the camera for about a minute so that we can do some accounting here. And Jerry, you know what? I think Jerry requires a round of applause for sharing his very insightful thoughts about government, which I am going to be arguing with in the next segment. I am starting recording for the 4th time. Okay, it is with great pleasure I'm going to introduce myself this time. I think this is the first time in a long time where I've been the speaker. Let me get to the slideshow. So for the next 30 minutes or so, you're not going to be seeing me unless I do stuff. I'm going to ask people not ask questions or interrupt for the next 30 minutes or so, because I have about 30 slides and it's going to take a while. So having said that, let me just start with this collection of slides is based on continuing discussions between myself and Jerry Van Sickle over the past 20 years, off and on. So it may not be a direct rebuttal to the things that Jerry has been talking about, but I think I got close. So we'll find that out in a moment. One of the observations I have is that over the last 20 years, I've spoken to a lot of people who are libertarians or wish to be libertarians or wish to argue with libertarians, and each one of these people, or many of them, have what they consider a silver bullet for how to fix things. And this use of the courts is Jerry's silver bullet. Now, I have a certain amount of disdain for silver bullets, mostly for two reasons. One, you can never get a whole bunch of libertarians to get behind a particular silver bullet. Jerry is probably aware that his push to have this political party get behind him has not resonated well. He's well reasoned, but it isn't something that we libertarians have gotten behind. The other silver bullets, some of them are just whacked out crazy. Jerry's is, and I will compliment you, well reasoned, but I am going to be arguing with it in this presentation. So here's some fundamental questions. What is freedom? Okay, Jerry is promoting the courts as a mechanism for enhancing freedom, but we didn't get an answer to what it is, and we could spend an entire lunch, and I hoped we will spend an entire lunch, as to what is freedom in a political context. We all sort of internally know what it is, and we're all libertarians here wishing to expand freedom, but what is it? Let me give you my particular take on it. Freedom is that state of politics where individuals need not fear interference by authority to do what they wish. Now, note this definition of freedom doesn't apply to everybody, and therefore the greatest freedom that one can have would be as a absolute dictator. You get to do what you want, and nobody else gets to argue with you. Do freedoms conflict? Obviously they do, and in Jerry's world, the courts will resolve your freedom versus my freedom. My freedom to use Jerry's property is limited by the freedom to defend that property, perhaps by force. Indeed, my mere existence constrains Jerry's freedom to defend his property for fear that I will steal his property. Some other fundamental questions. In a world where the judiciary is the primary holder of power, who determines jurisdiction? How to go to Roger's point earlier, how are decisions enforced when one party is physically or economically much more powerful than either the other party or even the court itself? And to enhance Roger's point, what happens if one of the parties just says, I don't want to live by this decision, or I don't even want to appear before the court? One of the questions that that Jerry did not address is, does loser pay in a particular court battle? Who decides if loser pays? I mean, here's a fundamental rule of law. Does the loser pay? Doesn't the loser pay? Who makes that decision? Is it the courts that make that decision? I don't know. Typically, a legislature would make that decision. And that is why I think legislatures are necessary. But I'll go to more of that in a moment. I want to repeat, or I'm going to say something that most of us have heard before. Lord Acton's famous aphorism: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence. Even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency of the certainty of corruption by authority. That's a direct quote from the letter he wrote in 1887. In your world, Jerry, the courts would wield enormous influence. Not necessarily power, not necessarily authority, but they would certainly have influence. In fact, they would have influence, the enormous power of influence, as the main centers of political and legal power. And as Lord Acton points out, power corrupts. Let's look at a system of government that somewhat resembles your worldview in terms of using the courts. So this is from the Islamic Supreme Council. A fatwa is an Islamic legal pronouncement issued by an expert in religious law, a mufti, pertaining to a specific issue, usually at the request of an individual or judge, to resolve an issue where Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh is what that's called, is unclear. And they continue by saying, we might compare a fatwa to the legal ruling of a high court or the Supreme Court, depending on the authority of the mufti behind it. However, a fatwa is not binding, as is the verdict of a secular court. While correct and applicable to all members of the Muslim faith, the fatwa is optional for the individual to respect or not. So let me repeat. While correct and applicable to all members of the Muslim faith, the fatwa is optional for the individual to respect or not. Isn't that a wonderfully libertarian point of view? And if I point the camera at Jerry, Jerry is laughing a little bit. So, the following slide is arguably the most famous fatwa known in the West. And this is the Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders World Islamic Front Statement 23 February 1998 by Osama bin Laden and a whole bunch of other Islamic judicial experts. If you wish to move over, I'm not recording video at this point. Okay. So this is what the fatwa said. On that basis, and this was actually a fairly long fatwa. On that basis, and in compliance with Allah's order, we issue the following fatwa to all Muslims. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. This is in accordance with the words of Almighty Allah. Think about that. Think that we now have a judicial ruling by a highly respected, at least in the Muslim world, judicial court saying, go kill Americans. It's kind of, that's the kind of power that corrupts. Now notice for a moment that the U.S. Supreme, that in the previous ruling, and let me go back to the previous slide, in the previous ruling, it is other people other than the court who carry out the orders of the court. These voluntary people in this particular case. Notice that in the United States Supreme Court, when it issues a ruling, it is in the same form of influence as an Islamic court when issuing fatwa. The Supreme Court has no army or other enforcement mechanism. It depends on others to enforce its rulings. Consider a very famous case. In Worcester versus Georgia, 31 U.S. 515 in 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court, the nation's highest court, ruled that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign. According to the decision rendered by Justice John Marshall, this meant that Georgia had no rights to enforce state laws in that territory because of a treaty between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. In addition, the Supreme Court wrote, in addition, it made the Indian Removal Act invalid, illegal, unconstitutional, and against treaties previously made by the United States. But President Andrew Jackson refused to uphold the ruling in this case and directed the expulsion of the Cherokee Nation U.S. Army forces were used in some cases to round up the people in the Cherokee Nation. Their expulsion and subsequent rout is called the Trail of Tears, which I'm sure almost everybody here has heard of. Of the 15,000 who left Georgia, 4,000 died on that forced march. 4,000 died on the journey to the Indian Territory in the present-day state of Oklahoma. Wow. The judiciary wielded influence but insufficient power to enforce its decisions. In Jerry's world, I wonder if the same thing would happen. They would wield influence, perhaps enormous influence, but perhaps be negated by local authority or local powers that don't subscribe to the ruling. This goes back to what Roger was saying. What happens if one side simply ignores things? That's what Andrew Jackson did. Our founding fathers instituted a system of government with checks and balances in order to preserve freedom. A lot of, almost all scholars, I think, agree that this system of checks and balances has served us well to preserve freedom as various factions are fighting for power, leaving most of us free to do what we wish. Now, I will say that we've lost a lot of our freedoms, but I'll get to that in a moment. I prefer to see this calling of this checks and balances, instead of calling it checks and balances, a system of government with competing centers of power. Here's a partial list of the centers of power as implemented by our founding fathers. They created an executive branch of government, a legislative branch of government, a judicial branch of government. They created the military. They created the they empowered or protected the fourth estate, that is, newspapers and other media protected by the First Amendment. They created an independent electoral college. They created individual states with centers of power. They gave to citizens holding the voting franchise the ability to vote in the House of Representatives for their representatives. They also created a well-armed citizenry protected by the Second Amendment. So you have all these centers of power fighting or protecting their turf. And this has served us, I believe, quite well. We live in what is a constitutionally limited democracy. So our very Constitution becomes a center of power, which one would hope the judiciary would respect. Sadly, we've seen that has been majorly eroded, but that's a problem with the judiciary. And therein lies a problem with using the judiciary as a sole mechanism for governmental power, because they will do what they will do. And in your world, there will be almost no countervailing power. In a constitutionally limited democracy like ours, the citizens with a voting franchise serve as one more counterbalance to concentrated political and economic power. In your world, that power doesn't even exist. Just because I have the right to vote, well, I don't even know if I have the right to vote in a world in which the judiciary is the central form of government. Your form of government, Jerry, goes in precisely the wrong direction in order to create and maintain human freedom, because you concentrate power in the judiciary, and instead of increasing the numbers of centers of power, and the courts, just like the Islamic judges, would be a form of government in your world. In your world, the number of centers of power would be cut basically to two: the courts and the citizenry. Here are some of the other problems that I've seen in your view of the world. As I see it, there would be no Supreme Court in your world, because that court would hold ultimate power and be able to overrule all the other courts. Here's some other questions I have for you that you didn't answer, and maybe you'll answer at the end of this. Who determines who sits on a court? Who determines who sits on the appellate courts? And ultimately on some Supreme Court? Do the litigants determine it? Do other courts determine it? On this question, you've been silent. I would like to hear an answer at some point. Who determines court rules? For instance, how many people sit on a jury? Is there a jury at all? How many people does it take to determine the result of a civil or criminal case? Again, I've not heard a whole bunch on that particular topic. You'll be able to answer. So here's my observation on politics. All of politics comes down to a single question: who decides? In your world, it would be the courts. In the world created by our founding fathers, we have checks and balances where some system arises where if one of the branches of government goes off the skids, other branches of government can say, no, you can't do that. And here are some other questions I have. Are there any questions of government that should not be determined by the courts? I reason that the courts are a very good mechanism for resolving conflicts of freedom when the conflicts involve small numbers of people. I reason the courts are a bad mechanism for resolving conflicts of freedom between and among large numbers of individuals, and such conflicts should be resolved by legislatures. Legislatures created and voted by democracy. Here are some possibilities where the legislature may be better at preserving freedom than courts. For instance, vaccination. When do individual rights outweigh herd immunity? We've had several discussions in this group on whether or not people should be forced by legislatures to be vaccinated. I don't think we've actually resolved that issue here, although we've heard good arguments on both sides. Pollution. When is too much pollution by an entity illegal or to be regulated? Do we want that to be regulated by a court, or do we wish to have that done by a legislature? I think a legislature is better at that than courts. I'm open to argument. Here's another question that I don't think the courts should be settling. Do children have rights, and do those rights outweigh parental rights? Are parents allowed to spank children? I don't think a court can resolve that issue. I may be wrong. And here's the big one. Even though our courts have stepped into the middle of this mess, should abortion be allowed? So, in conclusion, I think Jerry's system of government would work very well indeed if judges were wise angels. But judges are people with agendas, and some judges will use their power for corrupt purposes. And our current bloated government is, though, still better than I think your system of judicial, even though I've spelled judicial incorrectly in the slide, system of government, because we have the remnants of competing powers, of competing centers of political and economic power. That concludes my slides, which took about 25 minutes, and I thank you all for listening in. We have a comment from the gentleman sitting over there, and I would ask that you yell.
Several points. First, you confuse liberty and freedom. Liberty is the physical ability to move about. If you're put in jail, you lose your liberty. Freedom is the mental, spiritual, psychological ability to choose that is not affected by physical constraints. You cannot put the Buddha in jail. He lives on a spiritual plane. Second point, you mentioned Congress and the President and the Electoral College. The original scheme was to have the President be like a Prime Minister, the first among equals to wield the gavel at a meeting of Congress, which had all the real power. They reasoned that if you could say, the senator from Wyoming, I will give you a military base if you vote for me to be president, it ends up in a great deal of corruption. So they said, let's have a one-time only Congress, the Electoral College, have one elector from every congressional district and two more for every state for the senators, and then it will go away, so there's no way to enforce the corruption. That has been changed to the all-powerful imperial president, but the original scheme was to have it much more modest in the executive branch. And of course, we should talk about money, because money is 90% of politics, the great corrupter, because we have looked the other way at violations of the Constitution when taxes are imposed.
I will agree with this gentleman that the president was originally meant to be a presider rather than an executor. So, but we have what we have, and we have because we created a president with military power and with other powers granted to him by the Constitution, he's no longer a presider, but the chief executive officer of the United States.
Commander-in-Chief.
And the commander-in-chief as well. So I'm now going to swing over to Mike, unless Jerry wishes to respond. Hold on one second. I've got, and because he's the major speaker, so it's going to be Jerry, then it was Blake, and then Roger. Is that correct? Oh, I'm sorry. It was Jerry, then Mike. Then Blake, then Roger. So, Jerry, you're up.
I just want to say I'm only recommending that we put some of our money more than our pitiful money, into helping the Institute for Justice or any others, and maybe taking some suggestions from them to search for potential cases. So I'm not trying to defend the entire organization of human government as you've been describing.
Then I misunderstood you, and I apologize.
Okay.
The next person is Mike, and Mike, please take the microphone.
Jerry did a good job of just talking in this same direction that I was going to respond with. In my understanding of what Jerry has in mind, let's take an actual example. We have, say, $1,000 here that we could do something with. The question is, what is the best way to use the $1,000? Where's the leverage? As a party with a very small, with a small representation or with a small membership, where's the most leverage for that? And my interpretation is that one of the ways we could do that is to fight in the legal arena, as opposed to trying to put the money into creating our base, because we have a long ways to go there. But legally, we can be as well represented as just about any other group.
So I'd like to respond to that. And as one of the speakers, I get to make the rule. I ask you to come to our meeting on February 12th, if you can. I know that you're up in the mountains.
Yeah.
Where we spend our money, is it best to spend, if lawyers are even at a pro bono rate of, say, $100 an hour, we can spend that $1,000 on 10 hours of legal services. Or we can support one of our candidates and perhaps for $500 buy many minutes of television ads at 3 o'clock in the morning on, but it will be seen, okay? And we have Blake, then Roger.
You mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be confused about this, but you talk about judicial dictatorship. You talk about a judge having rule over people. Did you say something like that?
I'm saying that in a world in which there's virtually one of the things I didn't mention, Jerry, is something you've said many times, which is, in your world, the legislature would determine National Pizza Day, okay, and not much more. Okay, so I don't think I've misinterpreted you all that much. Would you agree to that, Jerry?
I exaggerated slightly.
Okay.
There's a bit of
So,
sarcasm.
Blake, what was your comment or question?
I want to make a comment or a
Sure.
question about, but I have to have clarification first.
Sure.
Did you say that judges exercise, in their judicial power, they exercise a form of dictatorship or dictatorial power?
I don't think I said that. I said that they can.
They can.
They,
Okay.
and it's certainly, for instance, in that fatwa, that was
Right.
dictatorial power
Okay.
exercised by a recognized judicial body of the Muslim faith.
Okay. So they're exercising a dictatorial type of power, and yet you favor the best form of government to be a dictatorship. So I'd like you.
What? Whoa!
I'm saying, before you respond,
Sure.
okay, I would really like clarification so I better understand the differences. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. I'm arguing two things. I'm arguing that the best form of government to maintain human freedom will be the form of government that our founding fathers instituted. I'm saying that the form of government that will get us back to a form of freedom would be a dictatorship. I really don't see how.
But not a judicial dictatorship.
Not a right.
Okay. And please help me understand
Sure.
the difference between a dictatorship and a judicial dictatorship. I don't see the distinction.
There isn't much of one. It is in a dictatorship. Somebody just says, "I'm dictator. You better follow my orders, or I'm going to kill you." In a judicial dictatorship, there is a facade, a veneer, if you will, of legality to what they're saying. I'm a judge, therefore I'm going to say what it is that the law is.
Okay.
And therefore I will use the law to make you do what I want you to do. Or make a third party who listens to me, because I'm a judicial dictator, do what I force you to do what I want you to do.
So in essence, you're in favor of honest dictators.
Yeah, I guess so.
Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Absolutely, yes, and I
Only except for Trump.
only except for a man by the name of Cincinnaticus. Ever hear of him?
Cincinnaticus? No.
Yes.
Founded Cincinnati?
No, the city was named after him.
Okay.
Cincinnaticus was a farmer, a former military man. Rome was being invaded, and I don't remember by whom, Huns, or the details elude me. And the Roman Constitution said, we will give to a dictator the right to be a dictator for 6 months. And so Cincinnaticus became general of the armies, basically dictator, defeated the Huns or the whomever was invading Rome at the time. Do you remember, Roger?
I don't know if it was. He was much before the Huns. The Huns were the 4th and 5th century, so it could have been the Carthaginians. I'm not sure.
Whomever it was, he defeated them, and then went back to farming. And for this, he is absolutely remembered. So it is possible to create a dictator for a short period of time in an emergency to restore or preserve, as it were, civil. I would say it would be, if I were dictator for 6 months, I would turn around this country. Mike, you'll be right after Ken.
500 BC.
Was it really? He was 500 BC, so way before. So
Yeah.
that would have been even before the Carthaginians.
So have I answered your question?
Yes, you
Mike?
have. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
So I want, just like Jerry wants nice judges who are angels, I would like a nice dictator who is an angel. And the only person I know of who's good at that is me.
George Washington.
Yeah, George Washington
Yeah, George
absolutely revered Cincinnaticus. Okay? So we have Roger and Roger. Yes, you're next.
Just first off, if the response is to what I would characterize as modest Jerry, so Jerry's modest proposal, which is that we should use some of our money for judicial activism, then I would totally agree. And again, as I said before, and I think the Institute of Justice, for example, I think does a great job. But it has to be understood that the Institute for Justice is kind of nibbling at the edges. And that's why, and I think that's the most we can get out of judicial activism, is they still do great stuff. As I mentioned, they're doing a lot against occupational licensing right now, but it's nibbling at the edges. And at the end, we have to also do something at the legislative aspect. In the case of immodest Jerry, so the idea that we can basically turn the government over to the courts, and just have this stuff kind of spontaneously evolve in a Hayekian sense. The problem I have with that is the notion of that is like an evolutionary process. Okay, and as we know in evolution works because things spontaneously mutate, but then we have survival of the fittest, right? So there's a form of competition. And what I don't see in the immodest Jerry proposal is where the competition comes in that would determine that, okay, between these multiple factors, which is the best? And that's why I don't think it works as a general system.
We have the gentleman behind Jerry, who needs to yell.
First off, the Carthaginians were defeated by Scipio Africanus, who was a general, not the dictator of all of Rome. And so after he raised his own armies, defeated them, imposed the Carthaginian peace, he also retired.
I'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Remind me what we've been talking about before.
Thank you.
Dictatorship, basically, Blake's question.
Chuck Howe, a state representative from Boulder, used to say, dictatorship is the most efficient form of government except that it has no logical succession. So kings were set up so that their son would take over. George Washington was unable to have children with Martha Washington, no legitimate heirs. They offered him the kingship, and he declined. It is unclear how history would have worked out if he could have had a son and been offered the kingship.
Well, we've had John Adams and John Adams.
John Quincy Adams.
Right. So we had the two Adams starting something of a royal.
Trump.
Yes. Okay, Mike. And please take the microphone.
I just want to respond a little bit to a suggestion of there being a benign dictator. These days, that's the concept of martial law as a limited emergency powers, and my objection is the same as any government. So some government is good and more government is better, and all government is really good even if it's for a limited period of time. I'm just not buying it.
Bob Sheffield, please move the microphone.
Let me pass these around and each take one, and I'll
I would
appreciate any
like
further
to
contact.
point out, those who favor democracy, and by the way, I do, democracy is simply a way of avoiding bloodshed in a battle. You just count up the people on each side, and the one who has the most people on that side wins, and you don't have to shoot anybody. But realize that it's might makes power is what's behind democracy. Should democracy then be eliminated? No. There are appropriate places. The idea is you get to join those groups who use democracy in certain cases or not. We're kind of forgetting what I feel is the very basis of libertarianism, which everything is voluntary. Even people who do bad things to other people, they do it voluntarily, and you voluntarily defend yourself against it. to whatever point is required to prevent that person from doing any more of it. Maybe that's some sort of imprisonment. Maybe it's just throwing them out, which was the common way back. And this comes, by the way, from some studies in the Indian tribes and how they worked. Now, they did make a bunch of rules about land management and stuff, which everybody had to agree with. But if they didn't agree, they went somewhere else.
Roger, you're next.
No, I think, look, what you're saying in terms of social pressure and ostracism is certainly a very powerful force. I'm not denying that. And I also say that for 99.9% of the interactions we have with other people, we rely upon these type of, voluntary mechanisms to, I don't, to deal with it. Blake said earlier that, this was a case where I was talking way too much. And he pointed out that the norm within this group is that we don't do that, and I immediately stopped. All right, but the problem is, at the end of the day, I'm a good actor. Okay, the problem and dealing with me is not the problem. The problem is what do we do with bad actors? All right, and that's when and likewise, likewise. You can't have something where okay, I'm going to deal with bad actors. If I run into you, to go to my early example, if I run into you with my car, and you say to me, oh look, you've damaged my car, it's clearly your fault, would you compensate me for this? And I refuse. I just refuse. We can't have a situation where you can say, okay, but I'm going to throw you in jail. All right? Because you may be a bad actor, and maybe I didn't actually damage you, and maybe I'm not the bad guy in the scenario. It just doesn't work.
To the community at that point.
What does that mean? That we hold a vote?
No.
What is that?
You and I have this dispute, and one of us, there's a county big enough for both of us. So we call on our
Yeah, but
neighbors.
we've all seen.
Okay,
We've all seen.
I'm going to suggest that I'm the next speaker.
Okay, sorry.
There is a conversation going back and forth here, and I want to voluntarily associate with the culture that we've created in this group. Okay. So
Blake, you were next anyway. So
that's exactly why I broke
But
in.
I'm a neighbor in the community, so.
One second.
So let me make my point. It's very similar to what your point is, but it's more simple than that, okay? I had an experience when I was in the Navy Reserve of being in St. Louis at a training, and I was talking to this young gentleman from the hood who explained to me if that woman has and I'm not going to use the racial concept that he described, but if that woman has a fur coat, why shouldn't my girl have a fur coat? Okay, so then he justified theft by saying, I don't have it, why shouldn't I have it? I deserve it. So in a case like that, and I asked him point blank, what's to prevent me from stealing the stereo out of your convertible? And his response was, because I'll put a cap in your ass. Okay? So we don't want to get to that point, but it's in my self-interest to live in a society where bad actors are shunned. Bad actors are disassociated from our group, our culture, and they're told to go away and leave us alone. And I think that's done in the market, just like everything else is done in the market. If we as a group decide, we don't want to have anything to do with you, Roger, I'm sorry, you're out of here, then we have that right, and you won't feel comfortable coming back. No, I'm using it as a bad example, but you understand where I'm coming from. That's what
I'm
it is.
trying to determine who's next. What I have on my list is that this gentleman over there is next. Was that correct?
Yes.
Deidre, you will be. So it's gentleman, Blake again, Mike, and then Deidre. Or did I get Blake twice?
No, you got me twice.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, you're next, and please yell.
let me introduce the concept by A.J. Galambos, who spoke and wrote eloquently about liberty. He was a physicist and spoke in the 1960s. His ideas were not widely circulated because he charged you for his ideas, had you sign a non-disclosure agreement. After he died, his family said, okay, come get them. And so there have been edited summaries of his lectures, etc. They are excellent. And he introduced the following thing to deal with automobile accidents. Instead of a governmental process, which is quite bureaucratic, you have two insurance adjusters sitting down, and in an afternoon they process 20 or 50 claims, and they say who caused the accident that hurt Roger's car, and who did, and they compare notes and they form a reasonable assessment, and then they pay some money. So the problem gets taken care of by your insurance company, and he defines them not as they are in our very flawed world, but as the libertarians view insurance companies. And they handle things like security and identity. You go to apply for a job, they say, okay, who will vouch for you? And so this quickly and with competitive market forces makes simple problems of the fact that people have auto accidents. They're better handled not as a non-profit, as a fault-free system, which some people have advocated, but rather as a fault determined by private forces, and then it's resolved and you move on to the next case.
So I'm gonna jump in here since I'm speaker. Sir, please compare if a legislature determines that the most effective, cheapest mechanism for adjudicating, if you will, car accidents is no fault. That is, you have the accident, there are no people to say what's going on. The accident occurred, money is exchanged from the insurance companies, and you move on. Isn't that a legitimate function of a legislature to determine?
No, the legislature makes a mess of everything.
You're assuming the conclusion.
There was a Colorado legislator who had a sign on his desk, "No man's life, liberty, or property is safe while the legislature is in session." And
That's a Mark Twain quote.
Mark Twain.
Or Will.
he was popularizing it from his position as a legislator. No one has any reason to disagree with him. I'm saying that without statist intervention, you have mechanisms which push for more efficient and just resolution of disputes, as I described.
It is Blake again, but you
No,
spoke. Okay.
you got me
so
down
it'll
twice.
be Mike, then Deidre. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak?
It was
Jerry wishes to speak. Jerry, whoa. Jerry, as one of the speakers, you get to jump in at any time.
It's a perk.
Why isn't the end result dictated by the fact that you can challenge any legislation in court?
Because the courts defer too much to the political body, and they refuse to overrule 98% of legislation which is unconstitutional. Let me use a simple example. When we had prohibition, they amended the Constitution to allow Congress that power. When bureaucracy wanted to keep their jobs after the end of prohibition, ended by jury nullification, you have the marijuana laws without a constitutional provision in violation of the 10th Amendment. And we had all kinds of messed up things. because
Mike, are you
they
leaving? I'm sorry.
refused to follow the Constitution.
I apologize for cutting in on you.
The courts have a much more vital role, and they've been emasculated by common agreement among the press and the people and the politicians. And so you do not have vigorous rulings of unconstitutional for 98% of the legislation, giving as an example the marijuana prohibitions by Jeff Sessions and his ilk because they refuse to rule them unconstitutional.
We have Mike.
One of a book that has given me a lot of insights in how things are, put it politely, screwed up as they are, is a book by the name of The Sociopath Next Door, and it's written by a psychologist who points out that 4% of the population, in fact, has little or no empathy, the so-called sociopaths. I believe that most sociopaths
End up in the legislature.
Yes. But when we talk about the concept of bad actors, we're trying to accommodate to a significant extent a subpopulation that has really influenced our distrust of people. I believe a lot of distrust is either because of the sociopaths or the influence that they wield. So I just wanted to amplify a little bit about the concept of bad actors. And yes, Jerry, I most certainly agree that although most sociopaths are very socially misfit, a significant number of them do appear to end up in Washington, D.C. and from there on down.
I'm going to add something to that. Everybody here remember the website Ashley Madison?
Yes.
Does anybody know what Ashley Madison was? Ashley Madison was
A dating site.
It was a dating site for married people to have affairs. And the Ashley Madison the statistics gatherers did an analysis of where they were getting most of their clients, or many of their clients, and the highest concentration of clients came from the Washington, D.C. area. We have Deidre, then this gentleman behind us.
I just have a concern about the size of societies that you can have, Bob, in the kind of voluntary, cooperative, rely on your neighbors for dispute resolution picture that you're painting, and the complexity of transactions that those societies can tolerate.
So may I answer?
Please take the microphone and then answer. And let me swing the camera toward you,
Okay.
Bob.
Yeah,
There we go.
Deidre, you really bring up a good point. There's so much left out of this conversation. For instance, supportive institutions. Other institutions are out there. They would be there in a court-only legislative function, if you call it that. Courts don't legislate, but they make decisions that guide the influence the behavior of people. Should be and will be other institutions that help us guide ourselves. The big point is none of them are forced on any individual. Now, I've been diagnosed with Asperger's, which means no empathy, and yet I can't get a single vote. So,
No, Asperger's is a very mild form, so that's why you can't get any votes. You have to be more extreme.
oh my God, I have to show my psychopathy.
You have to give it fuller rein.
It just occurred to me that in the last few weeks, Donald Trump has been accused of mental deficiencies. Not one single person has accused him of Asperger's yet. So,
No, because people with Asperger's are actually typically highly intelligent as well. So that's why nobody has accused him of that.
Deidre, you're next.
In New Zealand, they did a study of the prisoners who had committed serious major felonies. They found that 51% of them were psychopaths, very similar to sociopaths.
The DSM-5 doesn't.
And yet they formed 1% of the population, so it's disproportionate. I wonder about the corollary. Are 51% of corporate CEOs psychopaths because they have an advantage of climbing to the top no matter whose face they have to step on?
I don't have any answer to that.
There's a
But
book-
it certainly makes a certain amount of sense that those with high levels of perhaps testosterone or who have low levels of self-restraint or compassion make it to the top of corporate heaps. And the next person is Roger.
I was just to answer, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Ken.
Ken. To answer Ken's question, there's a book written on this subject. I forget the title of it, but it's exactly this, which claims that a large amount of CEOs are sociopaths. But really, just to go back to Deirdre's comment, which I think is exactly right, and it's also a little bit of a response to Blake's comment, the reality is that your type of social ostracization works best in small, in kind of small groups where everyone knows everyone. And if you this is a standard theory of evolutionary psychology, okay? That basically, and that actually works very effectively. So for example, one of my standard responses to people who talk about how great Scandinavia is and how they have this very socialist society which still seems to function very well. You don't understand. I actually went on a trip to Sweden after there was an accident that killed about 400 people. Everybody I met in Stockholm that night knew somebody who was on this boat that sank. Okay? So you can do things in very small societies which rely upon ostracization and knowledge, right? Because if I do something bad to you, then you will never do business with me again, okay? But that is minor compared to if nobody will do business with me, okay? And the problem is when we have large, complex societies with a great deal of anonymity, we cannot rely upon that same factor. And that is one of the reasons why, unfortunately, we just can't rely on these voluntary matters.
It is going to be Ken, Bob, and then, was it Blake?
One group that has a way of dealing with this is the Quakers. They have a preference for consensus or unity. So the meeting will have a business meeting, they'll sit around and discuss, and it might take a long while before the last holdouts cave in. Sociologists have studied this, they give the number at about 150 maximum.
Correct.
Where you can deal with that. That's why meeting houses are small, and if you have many of that people in a society, you have many separate meeting houses, and they evolve a culture of understanding where people come from, how far they can push it before they say, okay, you win, but they are also fully heard.
As one of the speakers, I'm going to jump in here. Who here knows where the phrase outlaw comes from? When you, in England and in many other places, when you were sort of excommunicated from the town, you went outside the town limits, and in this town everybody sort of knew each other. Outside the town limits, you were outside the law. You were an outlaw. Okay.
And that
was it Roger next?
That meant, I think, that you were outside the protection of the laws.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe it's Ken, Bob, and then Blake.
David Friedman has done an extensive study of Iceland, which spent 700 years far from any connection. And they had 36 judges and no other political force. If somebody wronged you, you would accuse them, you'd go before one of the 36. They would issue a verdict. You either complied with the verdict or you became an outlaw. This is not outside of the village fence. This is within the society without the protection of law.
Bob, and please move give Bob the microphone.
I just have two words in response to this business of large crowds not being able to ostracize. Julian Assange.
Okay. Julian Assange is a hero to many, and outlaw to many, well, or criminal to many. I don't know personally what he is, whether he has net done something that's good or bad.
It's been suggested he's a sociopath.
Okay, and were you being serious about that, Mike?
Yeah, yes. I just was trying to get a word in edgewise, but yes, specifically, I believe the bail that he posted, he got from his friends and supporters, and he then skipped town on that bail. And there's other instances that suggest that he has very low empathy.
All right. Now we had Bob, then.
So
So Blake, you're next.
So how do I follow that?
Tap dance.
I'm going to read a quote.
Have to.
I'm going to read a quote that kind of, in a way, comes into this. And then I'm going to make a comment about large groups and small groups and that sort of thing, and bad actors. The fundamental problem of politics is not the control of wickedness, but the limitation of righteousness. And I think that pertains to what we're talking about. So if we're righteously against a particular group or individuals or whatever, we really need, in a political sense, to be aware of that and to be concerned about controlling that righteousness, limiting that righteousness, rather than controlling the wickedness. So the emphasis would be on the righteous Islamic fundamentalists are a bigger problem for us than the crook down the street who's just being wicked. Now,
I think there's a lot of merit to what you just said. One
Thank
man's
you.
righteousness is another man's evil, and therefore the best solution is to let people sort of work out the problem.
And the two key words there are control and limit. So we can limit. It's easy within a body of law or culture, whatever you want to call it, to limit righteousness. It's very hard to control wickedness. But getting back to what we're talking about in terms of large groups, small groups, I don't see a problem with that. A large group can be very aware of gypsies who come to town and do. I had a guy come up to me in the parking lot the other day and says, you know, my boss doesn't know I've got this home theater. Are you interested in a home theater? I'd give you one for free. I waved goodbye at him because I knew it was going to come next. But we learn as people, as individuals, and as groups to avoid these people that are bad actors. Why are there laws against murder? And this will be my last comment. Laws are against murder to control vengeance. Not for justice, but to make sure that if you kill I don't have a daughter, but if you kill my daughter, I'm going to come after you. That's all I have to say.
And I will, Blake is next. Oh, I'm sorry, anybody else after Blake? Okay, then I will make a comment
Did I shut it down?
on that. That is a particularly Western position. In other cultures, we have the notion of honor killings, where even minor transgressions, my daughter is wearing a miniskirt, she deserves to die. Kind of sad, but do we as a Western culture have the right to enforce or implement our notion of justice on a different kind of society? Clearly, if people are living here and we accept the notion that geography dictates jurisdiction, then no, we shouldn't allow honor killings. Yes, Blake.
I would like to address that. So, honor killings are a cultural thing. So if you belong to a culture, if you live in a culture where they think that honor killings are the way to go, that's part of your culture. And you either agree with that or disagree with that. And you have
But
two.
what happens if those people live here? Does geography or does group association trump?
So let me finish. Okay? So in a culture, if you're in a culture that doesn't agree with you, you have two options. You have the option to leave the culture or to change the culture. When somebody comes to our culture, and there's the old story about, don't worry about the Soviets, because if they come over here, within 2 generations, they'll be capitalists. Don't worry about the communists. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's an old saw. So when a person comes into our culture, we call ourselves a big melting pot, and people embrace our culture. And if they believe in honor killings, they're not going to be part of our culture, because we will, I don't care how small or large the group is, we will in effect ostracize them. We have somebody in power right now that doesn't want to have certain people coming to our country, and he wants to build a wall. He's xenophobic, and he wants to make sure that we don't have influence of our culture. I'm much more, I trust people more. I trust, if you want to call it the wisdom of the crowd, call it the wisdom of the crowd. However you want to look at it, I really think that our culture, as strong as it is, as long as we don't interfere with the ability of people to express themselves culturally, you're not going to see a problem with bad actors. As you're always going to have bad actors.
So you laid out 2 possibilities. They can either leave or they can change the surrounding culture. But there's a third option. They can ignore the culture that they're in and abide by their own local culture. So I asked Blake, before I ask Ken to proceed, imagine we have a island of people who believe in honor killings surrounded by a much larger island of people who find it completely repulsive. Which one of those is the right culture to abide by the law? Like,
So you're asking me which culture is the right culture to abide by the law, and my saying is we don't need to worry about what the law says. We simply need to decide on a voluntary associating basis, do we want to associate with people who believe in honor killings? I would not want to associate with them. I would not want to have anything to do with them. Now, if they come after me and mine, I may want to. Now, there are laws against murder. So, because there's a law against murder, because we can't go and do an honor killing against somebody else, okay, the law would then come into that at some point.
so you're saying...
I'm
Well,
contradicting
I'm
myself.
confused as to
I'm
what-
confusing myself. So.
Good.
Please
sorry.
ask a clarifying
Roger
question.
after Ken.
Okay.
Loudly.
Several points. The Soviet Union was coming around to capitalism because of access to Playboy magazine and Levi's blue jeans.
Yes.
So it wouldn't have taken 2 generations, and we wouldn't have had 2 generations get it resolved. It would resolve much more quickly. In ancient times, the 10 Commandments were one tribe's branding in the midst of other people. You go to a crossroads, you have a market spring up, somebody is there and they say, what is your faith? He says, Jewish. And you say, do you swear by all you find holy? Right? 10 Commandments, first ones. That's not a religious set of injunctions, that's a commercial set of injunctions. That what you're selling me is good, it's unadulterated. And occasionally somebody would cheat, and then the rest of the tribe would say, hey, you're wiping out all of our ability to engage in commerce.
Trust.
Because you did not follow the code of trust. We're this kind of people. If you want to be one of us, you need to honor these things and quit cheating in your business dealings.
Our next guest is Roger.
I'll be just very brief. I was just going to say with Blake is that if I were the victim of an honor killing, I would take very little comfort in knowing that that person is going to be ostracized. Excuse me.
We have Blake and then Bob.
So I'm going to address that, Roger, and I understand exactly how you feel, but again, it's in my self-interest to protect my stuff and to protect my person. And if you kill one of mine, where does it in my self-interest to kill you? Because then doesn't that say, well, then you can kill me or you can kill somebody else? And don't we then have this whole society of people wanting to kill each other? So that's all I'm going to say about that. The gentleman,
Homicides are never solved.
that's true too. The gentleman in the corner did bring up something earlier about trust.
So that means we don't try?
So the gentleman in the corner brought up something about trust in commercial circumstances. So for me, I'm trying to formulate this thought clearly. We have, in many cases, worshiped the cult of law. We're saying, oh, we don't need to do anything. We don't need to take care of ourselves. We don't need to be concerned about, is this person going to cheat me? Because I can always sue them, or I can always call the cops on them. So if we had no law, as they didn't have back in ancient times, as the gentleman in the corner said, and you had to develop a situation to where you then could decide who to trust. I have a group on Facebook that it's a closed group, and the only reason for that is that so I can be sure who comes into the group. I give everybody in that group the opportunity to also approve anyone else to membership. And I've only had to kick one person out. It's like, you come into my living room, you're not going to come into my living room to sell your goods. Okay? You come into my group, you're not going to come into my group to sell your goods. You're going to come into my group to have civil discourse. Thank you.
We have Bob, Ken, Roger.
I just want to repeat what I said.
Could you thank you. I just need microphone near you.
Oh. I just wanted to repeat what I said when you were on the phone,
Okay.
but I've forgotten his name.
It's Roger.
No, his name, Roger, yeah. Julian Assange.
Julian Assange. Okay.
Yeah, about group ostracization.
All right.
Okay.
Then we have Ken. Please yell.
With Julian Assange, you have the case of the state saying those are our secrets, you're not allowed to take them, versus the people, where people are delighted to know, horrified to know, that their state is spying on them illegally, unconstitutionally, constantly. Dennis Montgomery stole 47 hard disk drives filled with files. 20 million Americans have been comprehensively spied on. Also, I'd like to point out that Sharia law keeps showing up in U.S. legal opinions. That is not an ethnically related or a religious proponent related, that is a statism related response.
You know what? Do you wish to respond to
I would
that?
like to respond to that, yeah.
Please move the microphone close to you.
Yeah, my point was not who's right or who's wrong about Julian Assange. My point about that is large groups can indeed ostracize people.
And you know what, Roger? I'd like you to be the last speaker.
Okay, I'll be brief as well. No, my point is this: is that yes, all of these things work, and I always say that I always say that I was in business for many years, and I always say a contract is like a prenuptial agreement. Okay, as long as the relationship goes nicely, it stays in the drawer. Nobody cares. Okay, but at the end of the day, everybody knows that the contract is there in the case somebody deviates. And the other thing I'd point out is that the economies advance in two ways. They advance in multiple ways, but one of the ways they advance is through a division of labor and through expansion of the market. So in other words, the more sophisticated economy becomes, the more there is a division of labor, the more I'm dependent on other parties, and also the overall size of the market gets larger. And what I'm suggesting is that your notions of justice, which are based upon small groups, everyone knowing each other, ostracization, everything, cuts against the general need that we have for economic advancement, which is specialization and larger organizations.
Economies of scale.
Economies of scale. Economies of scale and specialization is a lot of what drives an economy. And it's very difficult to have economies of scale and you see this again. You see this in Italy, for example. Okay, and again, I was in Europe for 25 years. Italy, the legal system sucks. It takes 10 years to get a court decision. Okay, the consequence of that is that you have everybody is really dependent upon personal relationships rather than knowing that in the back of the day they have a legal system that actually works. This is a tremendous impediment to the advancement of the Italian economy. And I have had Italian businessmen from reputable institutions basically tell me, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong, but you know what, go ahead and sue me because I know it's going to take you 10 years. And you cannot have a functioning economy where you don't have that legal bedrock.
And with that, I would like everybody to give themselves a round of applause because this was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. So, Jerry, I think we may want to do another session on this issue again, but this time focusing on where the most efficient place to put our resources, our limited resources, would be. Does everybody sort of agree that that is a worthwhile for a session? We have Deidre, we have Roger nodding, Blake is...
Can I make a suggestion?
You may make a suggestion.
You're talking about one single alternative that you're going to...
No.
Okay, so let me just put that out as a possibility. If you're talking about one final option,
Okay.
use approval voting.
Pardon?
Use approval voting.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn off the camera. Again, thank you so much, Jerry, for your efforts.
Thank you, Ralph.
The other day, a
Thank you
guy
so much.
who was a great
And I'm now going to turn off the
everything
camera.
else is Chris
Recording.
Novoselic,
It's,
who I saw at a reason. He's